Every good detective needs a benefactor. If you are captivated by these original Sherlock Holmes adventures, consider supporting us on Patreon. You will be rewarded with early access to our tales before they reach YouTube. Your monetary support truly makes these productions possible. The link to our Patreon is in the description below. The Case of Mathews. It is a curious thing, the way certain cases engrave themselves upon one's memory. I recall them because of their intellectual challenge, the villainy they exposed, and the singular, indelible mark they left upon my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Of the many thousands of adventures I have had the privilege to chronicle, few contained such an element of personal peril and profound, almost humbling experience for Holmes as the affair of Mathews, the so-called King of the Docks. Indeed, the faint discoloration upon his lower left canine, a curious shade of ivory, remained a subtle testament to that titanic struggle, visible only when he would clench his jaw in a rare moment of pique or intense concentration. The incident, as many readers will recall from my brief allusion in The Adventure of the Empty House, was one of the few occasions where the great detective found himself physically overpowered before the strategic application of his unique martial prowess brought the ruffian to justice. It was during the bleak, blustery end of March in '91, a time when the tempestuous winds of early spring mingled with a peculiarly oppressive density of London fog, that the name of Mathews first began to circulate in whispers amongst the constabulary. Scotland Yard, through the person of Inspector Lestrade, a man for whom I held a guarded respect, though his methods were ever a blunt instrument compared to Holmes's rapier, had been vexed for months by a burgeoning protection racket plaguing the shipping docks. From Blackwall to Wapping, a shadow of fear had fallen over the honest mariners, the warehousemen, and the myriad small merchants whose livelihoods depended on the ceaseless ebb and flow of Thames commerce. "He is a veritable plague, Watson," Holmes observed one rain-swept evening, pacing before our Baker Street fire, a copy of the Police Gazette held loosely in his hand. The article detailed yet another arson attack upon a shipping company that had refused to pay Mathews's extortionate insurance fees. The man operates with an impunity that suggests either a network of informants within the yard itself, or a capacity for violence so extreme that it has cowed even the hardiest of the dockland populace. "Surely, Holmes, the police have made arrests," I ventured, attempting to follow his rapid deductions, which often left my more pedestrian mind scrambling to keep pace. "Oh, arrests there have been, my dear fellow, a score of them, though they never catch Mathews himself. His lieutenants, his foot soldiers, they are interchangeable, like the pawns in a particularly savage game of chess. No sooner is one apprehended than another springs forth from the murky depths of the East End, equally brutal, equally anonymous. The system, Watson, is the problem. Mathews has imposed a feudal tyranny upon the docks, and the honest bobby is ill-equipped to dismantle such a structure without first understanding its foundations. Our involvement, as was often the case, began with a desperate plea. Mr. Arthur Finch, a portly, anxious man whose shipping concern, Finch and Sons, had operated with integrity for generations, presented himself at Baker Street one morning, his face pale, his hands trembling. He had received a final warning from Mathews, a crudely drawn skull and crossbones affixed to his warehouse door. "He demands £50 a week, Mr. Holmes," Finch exclaimed, wringing his hands. £50! My margins are already so thin, what with the competition from the foreign lines. And the police, bless their hearts, they say they can do nothing unless I have proof. Proof? How can I get proof when his men work in the shadows, and those who speak out find their goods ruined, their men beaten, or worse? Holmes listened with an almost preternatural stillness, his eyes half closed, a thin plume of smoke rising from his cherished pipe. When Finch had finished his lament, Holmes tapped a long finger against the polished surface of our table. "Mathews, you say, Mr. Finch. What do you know of his background?" "Only that he is a veritable leviathan, Mr. Holmes, possessing the raw, unbridled power of a draught horse and a temper to match. They say he was a bare-knuckle pugilist in his youth, won every prize fight south of the river. And he has a certain presence, a look in his eye that chills a man to the bone." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "a physical specimen. Rarely does pure brawn present such an enduring challenge to the law. There is generally a weakness, a vanity, an Achilles' heel that can be exploited. This Mathews, it seems, relies entirely on terror and the tacit acceptance of his dominion." The following days saw Holmes immerse himself in the underworld of the docks with an intensity that left even me breathless. Disguised variously as a retired merchant sailor, a casual labourer, and once, rather convincingly, as a foreign seaman with an impressive beard and an incomprehensible patois, he vanished into the labyrinthine alleys and grimy taverns of the East End. I, of course, was left to tend to my practice, though I often found myself scanning the evening papers for news of violence, my mind consumed with worry for my friend. He returned one evening looking utterly exhausted, his disguise discarded, his face etched with a grim determination. "The man is a force of nature, Watson," he declared, dropping into his armchair, rejecting the offered supper in favour of a particularly potent brew of tobacco. "His organisation is frighteningly efficient. He levies a tax on every shipment, every dock worker, every small business within a 3-mile radius of the docks. Those who pay are protected. Those who refuse face immediate and brutal reprisal. And the fear, Watson, is palpable. No one dares speak his name above a whisper." "You have learned something useful, I hope?" I pressed, ever eager for the details of his subterranean explorations. "I have learned that Mathews himself rarely shows his face. He operates through a complex hierarchy of enforcers, each of whom commands a territory, and each of whom is utterly devoted to him. He has fostered a cult of personality, a distorted sense of loyalty, by ensuring his followers are handsomely rewarded and ensuring traitors simply vanish." Holmes spent the next week dissecting the information he had gathered, spreading maps of the docklands across the carpet, marking points with pins and string, like a general plotting a campaign. He deduced that Mathews had a central control point, a hub from which he coordinated his network. This, Holmes believed, was a dilapidated warehouse on the waterfront, ostensibly abandoned, however, in reality, a hive of clandestine activity. "He uses it for his larger meetings, Watson, and I suspect as a secure vault for his ill-gotten gains. It is there that he makes his plans, and it is there, if I am to understand the man's character, that he would be most vulnerable." Our surveillance of the warehouse began under the cloak of deepest night. Holmes, with his extraordinary ability to blend into any shadow, spent hours observing the comings and goings, noting the subtle patterns of the gang's movements. I, though less adept at such stealthy work, provided a steady hand and a reliable lookout from a safe distance. It was during one such vigil, with the late March fog rolling thickly off the Thames, that Holmes decided to act. He had observed Mathews himself entering the warehouse, accompanied by 2 hulking bodyguards, and then, crucially, dismissing them shortly thereafter. This was an opportunity, a rare moment when the behemoth might be isolated. "I believe, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice barely audible above the rhythmic lapping of the river against the piers, "that Mathews is conducting a solo inventory tonight. A moment of self-congratulation, perhaps. This is our chance to observe him directly, and perhaps glean some vital piece of evidence that will allow us to break his hold." With meticulous care, Holmes began to navigate the treacherous landscape of the dockside, a labyrinth of stacked crates, mooring ropes, and treacherous puddles. I followed, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, fully aware of the danger. The fog offered concealment while simultaneously amplifying every creak of timber and distant clang of metal, transforming the groan of settling timber and the distant clanking of mooring chains into a disorienting phantom symphony. Holmes reached the rear of the warehouse, where a single grimy window offered a sliver of light into the cavernous interior. He peered through, his form a wraith against the gloom. After a moment, he beckoned me forward, his expression taut with excitement. "He is there, Watson! Alone! And by heavens, he is counting a vast sum of money. It confirms my hypothesis. This is his inner sanctum, his treasury." As Holmes spoke, a sudden guttural roar erupted from within the warehouse. The light from the window momentarily flared as a lantern was flung across the room. We heard the crash of wood, the splintering of glass. Then a chilling silence. "He heard me," Holmes breathed, his face contorting in a rare moment of self-reproach. "My own careless whisper. He is far more alert than I gave him credit for." Before I could react, the rear door of the warehouse burst open with an almighty crash. Silhouetted against the dim interior light stood a truly colossal figure. He was, as Finch had described, a giant of a man, with shoulders like an ox and arms that seemed capable of tearing down a brick wall. His face, partially obscured by the shadows, bore a look of savage fury. This, without doubt, was Mathews. "Spies, eh?" Mathews' voice was a low growl, like a dangerous predator. "Thought you could sneak up on old Mathews, did you? I'll teach you to meddle in my affairs." He moved with astonishing speed for a man of his bulk, closing the distance between us in a few powerful strides. Holmes, ever quick-witted, did not hesitate. He launched himself forward, seeking to surprise the brute with a swift, calculated strike. What followed was a blur of motion and raw, brutal force. Holmes, despite his slender frame, possessed an almost unnatural agility and the striking power of a man far larger, honed by years of practice in various forms of self-defense. However, Mathews was entirely different. He met Holmes's attack with sheer unadulterated power rather than finesse. His blows displaced the very air around us, driven by a raw, uncoiled ferocity rather than any school technique. Holmes ducked beneath a mighty swing, attempting a feint, allowing Mathews to anticipate it. The docks became our arena, the fog our shroud. Mathews, bellowing like a bull, lunged forward, grabbing Holmes in a crushing bear hug. My friend, for all his strength, was simply dwarfed. I saw him struggle, his face contorted with effort, as Mathews began to squeeze, intending to crush the very life out of him. I fumbled for my service revolver. Before I could raise it, Mathews flung Holmes aside with a grunt of exertion. My friend stumbled, attempting to regain his footing as Mathews fell upon him again, raining down a terrifying series of blows. Holmes, usually so composed, was caught off guard, his carefully practiced defensive maneuvers overwhelmed by the sheer, unthinking brutality of his assailant. Then came the moment that would forever distinguish this case in my memory. Mathews delivered a vicious upward hook that caught Holmes squarely on the jaw. There was a sickening crack, audible even over the thudding of blows. Holmes staggered back, a cry of pain escaping his lips. A rare sound indeed. He stumbled into a stack of empty barrels, collapsing amongst them. Mathews, his chest heaving, stood over him, a triumphant, savage grin spreading across his face. "Thought you were clever, eh, little man?" he sneered. No one crosses Mathews and walks away. I saw my opportunity then, raising my revolver. Mathews, with an almost supernatural awareness, spun around, his eyes blazing, and began to advance on me. His size alone was intimidating, and the look of pure, murderous intent in his eyes was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. He was coming for me, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that he would show no mercy. Just as he reached me, a faint groan came from the tangle of barrels behind him. Mathews paused, turning his head. It was all the time Holmes needed. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, he pushed himself up, his hand clutching his jaw, his face a mask of pain. "Leave me, Watson," he rasped, struggling to his knees. "Bring Lestrade, go!" Mathews, seeing Holmes was still alive, let out another roar of rage and spun back towards him. He charged, a human battering ram, clearly intent on finishing what he had started. I, against my better judgment, hesitated, unwilling to abandon my friend. Holmes, with a furious glance, urged me again, "Go! My life depends on it." Reluctantly, my heart a leaden weight in my chest, I turned and fled into the fog, the sounds of another struggle fading behind me, muted by the distance and the dense air. I ran as I had never run before, the chilling image of Holmes's face, pale and bloodied, seared into my mind. I reached a cab stand, incoherent in my urgency, and eventually managed to impress upon the driver the need for haste to Scotland Yard. Lestrade, roused from his desk, listened to my breathless account with a mixture of disbelief and growing alarm. "Mathews, you say? And Mr. Holmes engaged him alone? Impossible. The man is a brute." Nevertheless, the urgency in my voice and the implicit danger to their most valued consultant spurred him into action. Within minutes, a squad of constables was mobilized, and we were speeding back towards the docks. The return journey was an agony of suspense. Had I been too slow? Was Holmes even now lying broken in that desolate warehouse? The thought was unbearable. When we finally arrived, the spring wind had begun to scatter the fog, revealing the grim reality of the docklands in the cold light of dawn. The warehouse door hung open, splintered from its hinges. Inside, a scene of devastation met our eyes. crates were overturned, barrels lay shattered, and the floor was littered with debris. There was no sign of Mathews nor of Holmes. My heart sank. Then a low moan echoed through the space. From behind a stack of tarpaulins, a figure slowly stirred. It was Holmes, his clothes torn, his face bruised and streaked with blood. He pushed himself to a sitting position, a hand still pressed to his jaw. "Holmes, are you hurt?" I rushed to his side, Lestrade and his men fanning out, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. He looked up, his eyes, though clouded with pain, still burning with that familiar intensity. "A trifle, Watson, a trifle," he managed, though his voice was hoarse. "Though I fear Mathews has permanently relieved me of a certain dental appendage." He opened his mouth, and there, a gaping void where his lower left canine had once resided, was a stark testament to the ferocity of the encounter. Lestrade swore under his breath. "The brute! He actually got the better of you, Mr. Holmes?" A flicker of annoyance, quickly replaced by grim determination, crossed Holmes's face. "He overpowered me, Inspector, through sheer unthinking force. A lesson, perhaps, in the dangers of underestimating a foe whose mind may be limited while his physical prowess remains formidable." He retreated, believing me incapacitated. A tactical error on his part, and a highly fortunate one for us. Holmes allowed me to examine him, noting a bruised rib and several lacerations alongside the missing tooth. Miraculously, there was nothing more severe. The empty space in his jaw, however, was a tangible scar, a physical manifestation of a defeat he rarely experienced. Over the next few days, Holmes was a man transformed. The physical indignity, the rare taste of defeat, fueled an almost terrifying resolve. He recovered quickly, his constitution proving remarkably resilient. The incident had ignited a personal fire. He spent hours in intense contemplation, often staring into the fire, a single unlit pipe clenched between his remaining teeth. "Mathews, Watson," he stated one evening, his voice low and intense, "is an anomaly. His strength is that of an elemental force, unreasoning, untamed. Against such a foe, pure intellect, unsupported by a countering physical discipline, is sometimes insufficient. I made the mistake of engaging him on his terms, in the darkness, where his animal cunning and raw power gave him an advantage. I assure you, I shall avoid repeating that error." It was then that he began to refine and practice his knowledge of Baritsu, a Japanese system of wrestling and self-defense that he had studied in theory for some time. "It is the art of leverage, of balance, of yielding to overcome," he explained, demonstrating a series of intricate movements that seemed almost balletic in their precision. "It allows one to use an opponent's own strength against him, to deflect and redirect, rendering the mightiest assailant helpless through the application of precise pressure points and joint locks. It is the perfect mechanical counter to a man like Mathews." He returned to his maps, scrutinizing them with renewed vigor. He had learned from his setback, resolving to avoid another direct brawl while engineering a confrontation entirely on his own terms. His previous foray had confirmed the warehouse was Matthews's treasury and a meeting place, revealing that Mathews was prone to moments of solitary reflection, counting his spoils. This vanity, this need to personally oversee his illicit wealth, was the crack in his armor. Holmes's plan was audacious in its simplicity, yet complex in its execution. He had discovered that Mathews held weekly meetings with his inner circle, always at the warehouse, always on a Tuesday night. These meetings were usually preceded by a solitary inspection of his strong room, where he would count the week's earnings. "We cannot confront him there directly, Watson," Holmes explained. "His men are too numerous, and the element of surprise is lost. We must lure him out. We will create a situation where Mathews feels compelled to leave his stronghold, where he will be isolated, and where I can engage him on terms dictated by intellect over mere muscle." The lure was a cleverly fabricated rumor. Holmes, through his network of informants, planted the story that a substantial cache of contraband opium destined for Mathews's coffers was to be intercepted by a rival gang. The rendezvous point for this fictional transaction was a deserted wharf several miles downriver from Mathews's main territory, a desolate spot known as Blackwall Reach. "Mathews's avarice, Watson, is his greatest weakness," Holmes observed with a wry smile. "He will never risk the loss of such a valuable shipment, especially if he believes it is being seized by a rival. He will go himself to protect his investment, and in his haste he will leave his usual retinue behind." The night chosen for the trap was another one steeped in the pervasive mists of early spring. It seemed the city itself conspired with Holmes in these elaborate deceptions. We concealed ourselves amongst the derelict barges and decaying warehouses of Blackwall Reach, the air thick with the smell of river mud and damp decay. Lestrade, though sceptical of the entire enterprise, had positioned his men discreetly in the surrounding alleys under Holmes's insistent instruction, ready to move in once Mathews was secured. Hours passed in an agonizing vigil. The silence was broken only by the mournful hoot of a distant foghorn and the drip of condensation from the corrugated iron roofs. My nerves were drawn taut as piano wire, every shadowed movement threatening to expose our elaborate ruse. Then, from the gloom, a heavy-set figure emerged, moving with a ponderous, purposeful stride. It was Mathews, alone, his massive frame barely discernible through the mist. He scanned the deserted wharf, his eyes narrowed, clearly suspicious. He held a heavy cudgel in one hand, ready for trouble. Holmes, who had been crouched behind a stack of rotting fish crates, moved with a sudden, silent swiftness that startled me. He stepped out from the shadows, directly into Mathews's path. "Good evening, Mathews," Holmes said, his voice calm and surprisingly clear in the oppressive stillness. "Looking for something?" Mathews stopped dead, his eyes widening in recognition and disbelief. His face twisted into a mask of pure rage. You've got a nerve showing your face again, you scrawny ferret. I thought I taught you a lesson." "A lesson, perhaps, in the limitations of brute force when applied without discipline," Holmes replied, his tone chillingly dispassionate. "And a lesson, Mathews, in the folly of underestimating an adversary." Mathews let out a bellow of fury and charged, his cudgel raised high, intent on delivering a decisive, bone-shattering blow. This was the moment. I braced myself, my hand on my revolver, ready to intervene if Holmes's plan failed. Holmes did not meet the charge head-on. Instead, he moved with the fluid grace of a dancer, sidestepping the wild swing. The cudgel whistled harmlessly through the air. As Mathews overshot, unbalanced by his own tremendous momentum, Holmes was already in motion. With astonishing speed and precision, he seized Mathews's wrist, stepping deep into the giant's guard. By pivoting sharply, Holmes transformed Mathews's own forward charge into a fulcrum. He applied a sudden, intense leverage against the man's elbow, forcing the joint into a painful, unnatural angle. Mathews roared in shock, his eyes widening as his powerful arm was suddenly rendered useless, trapped in an inescapable lock. Mathews struggled, his immense strength still formidable. Holmes clung to him like a limpet, stepping and turning to ensure every ounce of the brute's resistance only tightened the hold, seeking to control the man completely rather than to needlessly injure him. Accustomed to simple, direct conflict, Mathews was utterly bewildered by this mechanical form of combat. His cudgel clattered to the ground as Holmes, with a final decisive twist of his hips, brought the giant crashing down onto his knees. Mathews bellowed with genuine agony and disbelief alongside his rage. He thrashed, trying to break free, yet Holmes, though half his size, held him with a grip that seemed to defy logic. The art of Baritsu was a revelation to me, a truly ingenious system that turned a man's mass into his own prison. "Inspector Lestrade!" Holmes called out, his voice now slightly strained, yet triumphant. "Your man awaits." From the surrounding shadows, the constables emerged, their truncheons ready. Lestrade, his face a mixture of amazement and satisfaction, strode forward. He looked from the struggling, subdued giant of Mathews to the composed, breathless figure of Holmes, who calmly maintained his intricate hold. "Well, I'll be damned, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade declared, shaking his head. "You actually did it. No one's ever been able to lay a hand on Mathews, let alone pin him like a beetle." Mathews, thoroughly defeated and humiliated, ceased his struggles. He was hauled to his feet, his face contorted with impotent fury, his spirit entirely broken. The reign of the King of the Docks was over. In the ensuing days, with Mathews in custody, his network quickly unravelled. The fear that had gripped the docks for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Holmes, as always, accepted the accolades with his characteristic indifference, dismissing his own ingenuity as mere logical progression. "The case was instructive, Watson," he remarked one late March evening as I dressed the last of his minor wounds. He ran a contemplative finger over the gap where his tooth had been. "It reminded me that even the keenest intellect cannot always prevail without an understanding of the coarser forces at play in the world. Mathews, for all his brutishness, forced me to acknowledge a certain lacuna in my own preparation. The raw, animal strength of man, unchecked by reason, is a formidable weapon. The disciplined application of Baritsu, it appears, provides the perfect answer." He smiled then, a rare, genuine smile, as he lit his pipe. "A small price to pay for such an invaluable lesson, and for the restoration of order to an entire segment of this vast city. Though I confess, Watson, I shall have to pay a visit to my dentist next week. A finely crafted ivory replacement will be required to restore my jaw's symmetry, don't you agree?" I merely chuckled, content in the knowledge that my friend, though briefly humbled, had emerged from the crucible of this intensely personal battle victorious and perhaps even more formidable. The faint ivory discoloration that sometimes appeared when he clenched his jaw remained, for me, a silent testament to the case of Mathews, a struggle where the disciplined mind, aided by a newly acquired mastery of body, finally triumphed over unbridled savagery. Do not forget to check out our Patreon before you go.